Prof. I'm on the faculty in the Graduate School of Theology, and we are pleased to host this event tonight. I'd like to do a few quick introductions. First, I want to introduce the volunteers locally that are helping us out tonight. And first of all, John Takasugi is here. He is a Superior Court judge sitting in West Covina, and he's graciously volunteered to be here with us tonight. Thank you, John. A few other volunteers, several associated with the Graduate School of Theology, and I'll just stand as I call your names. Kelly Cabrera, Phil Powell, Luke King, David Best, and on trial tonight, playing the role of Jesus, is Daniel Tikach. I'm going to introduce to you one of the lawyers, one of the prosecuting attorney, and then he'll introduce the rest of the council here. Mark Osler is with us. He is on the faculty at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He's a graduate of William & Mary and the Yale Law School. He was a federal prosecutor for a number of years and worked consistently to confront the problem of inflexibility in sentencing and corrections. He was the lead counsel. As lead counsel, he won the case of Spears versus the United States in 2009 in the U.S. Supreme Court, where the court held that sentencing judges can categorically reject the 100-to-1 ratio between crack and powder cocaine in federal sentencing guidelines. He's worked a lot with sentencing guidelines, and there's a lot more I could say. He has a book called Jesus on Death Row, where he discusses issues related to capital punishment. And I'll welcome him and invite him to introduce the rest of the people here.
We haven't even started yet. We've already had a first. I've never, in my entire career of litigation, heard whoops for the judge. And you know what? That should happen more often. That's an excellent sign. We're very glad to be here. This is the 10th time that we've done this. We've done it in 8 different states. We've done it in Oklahoma, we've done it in Texas, we've done it in Virginia. It's important for us to do it here because of the referendum that's coming out. I'm very fortunate in that I have wonderful people that do this with me. The lead counsel for the defense is Jeanne Bishop, and Ms. Bishop is a public defender and has been for 22 years in Cook County, Illinois, which is the Chicago area. She is also one of the world's foremost advocates against the death penalty. Last year at this time, she was before the Parliament of Mongolia addressing them about the death penalty. She has spoken in Japan, she's spoken in France in French, which I find inconceivable, about the death penalty, but also is a part of this across the United States. Often when I talk about the death penalty, people say you wouldn't feel that way if it was your brother or your sister or your mother or your father or your child. And I don't know what that would be like, but Ms. Bishop does, because her sister, her brother-in-law, and their unborn child were killed by a 16-year-old boy some 20 years ago. And her thinking about the death penalty is largely from the perspective of someone who has had such a terrible loss. I'm also very blessed in that with me today are some of my favorite students. I'm a teacher, and that's what I love to do. And one of the great things about teaching is that I can involve my students in what's most important to me. And this is one of the things that's most important to me. To my right, and serving as my co-counsel tonight, is Joy Tall. She's a lawyer in Dallas. She was one of my students when I taught at Baylor from 2000 to 2010. And she was one of those students that you always want to have in your class. You walk in the first day, and if Joy Tall was in my class, I was very happy because she asked the questions that I needed to answer. And any professor knows that you need that student in your class, and it takes a special type of intelligence and bravery to be that student, and she was that student for me. At the far left here is Sarah Summermole. She is currently one of my students. at the University of St. Thomas. She's a true leader within that community. I first knew that Sarah was going to be somebody I wanted to involve in what I did when I said something in class and she threw both her arms straight up and I went, "Ah!" Because I was wrong. And I really was wrong. So, and as you're about to see, she does a wonderful job. Also, serving as a witness today, but yesterday serving as a lawyer, we did this at Fuller, is David Best, who's currently one of my students at St. Thomas as well. And as with Sarah, he's somebody that in my first year class stood out as having a real curiosity about what was important and what I thought was important. And again, I had to be careful not to call on him too much because I always wanted his arm to be up because I knew he would take me to a good place. I was often right about that. What we're doing tonight is not a scripted play. This is a real trial in a sense. Ms. Bishop and I are both trial attorneys. And so I don't know what her arguments in the end are going to be. And they've been different every time. I don't know what questions she's going to ask a witness. And so there is give and take that happens every time that we do this. We're going to be calling several witnesses. One of them is Peter. Now, of course, Peter did not testify in the trial of Jesus. But one of the ways that thinking about this process as a trial changes your thinking is exemplified by the role of Peter. We all know the story of Peter being called, a servant girl comes up to him as the trial's going on and says, "Do you know Jesus of Nazareth?" And he denies it 3 times. But doing this trial, it became clear to me what was going on there. And that is that Caiaphas, the prosecutor, his witnesses were conflicting. He sent the servant girl out to seek witnesses. And it may well be that Peter, in denying knowing Jesus, was seeking to protect him. It changes the way that I see everything, but I see it within my vocation and my faith at the same time. We're very fortunate in having a real and distinguished judge with us tonight, and I'll turn things over to him.
Thank you. Okay, calling the matter of people of the state of California versus Jesus of Nazareth. Counsel, would you please state your appearances?
Your Honor, for the state, Mark Osler. With me at counsel table is Joy Hall.
Your Honor, Jeanne Bishop, Assistant Public Defender, on behalf of Jesus of Nazareth, along with my co-counsel, Sarah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have summoned you all here today to act as trial jurors in the matter of the people of the state of California versus Jesus of Nazareth. I am John Takasugi. I'm a judge in this state, and I will preside over this hearing. Jesus has already been convicted of the crime of blasphemy. Your job as jurors will be to decide the penalty phase. That is the punishment of death or life without the possibility of parole. Would our entire audience please stand? Do you and each of you understand and agree that you will well and truly try the cause pending before this court and a true verdict rendered according only to the evidence presented to you and the instructions of the court? If you agree, please say, "I do." I do. Very good. Thank you very much. You may be seated. Once again, we are deciding the penalty phase only. And people, you may call your first witness.
Revoking statements, Your Honor.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Joy Hall, and I, along with lead counsel Mark Osler, represent the state in this matter. This is, as you've heard, a sentencing trial, which means that the defendant has already been convicted of a crime, and you must determine his punishment. You have 2 options. You may either sentence him to a prison term of a life sentence, or you may sentence him to death. What we have is an incredibly difficult job, possibly the most difficult one in all of American law, and it is one that I take no pleasure in. But it is essential. It's necessary to protect our community, to protect ourselves, to save our families, and our environment from being future victims of this man. We must ask you to execute the defendant. And the state of California provides a measure for determining whether or not you should do that. You must find one of two, what we call aggravating factors. And then you must determine those aggravating factors outweigh what we call mitigating evidence that cuts against those factors. The first aggravating factor that we will prove exists in this case is that his crime affects more than one victim. You will hear from his own followers. They abandoned their families. They did violence in his name, and they stood by while he destroyed the economy of entire towns. I tell you, that is massive victims, and we cannot afford any more. His crimes affect significantly more than one victim, and if we do not stop him, we may all be victims in the future. The second aggravating factor is whether his crime is especially heinous or dangerous. I believe you will find that the evidence proves this is true as well. It's heinous because he attacks the foundation, the fabric of who we are. He attacks our families, encourages mothers to abandon their daughters, and fathers to abandon their sons. What could be more heinous than to destroy entire families? I tell you, he aims at our economy. He defies the idea of capitalism and instead encourages a different way that our society cannot sustain. He encourages us to make ourselves vulnerable to our enemies, lay down our arms, to be at their mercy, and then, when they attack, when they do us damage, to permit them all to learn. Finally, he attacks the educated, those who are the most capable, our intellectual foundation as a society. He decries the educated, he castigates those who are scholars. Look at who he chooses as followers. People who can't read, people who are easily influenced by his magic, which we do not deny he is a man of great power. But he intentionally chooses to surround himself with people who will be fooled by that, who he can manipulate into doing what he wants. A man with that kind of power must be stopped, lest we all be at his mercy. And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, I can't even assure you, as a representation of the state, that a life in prison sentence is something we can assure you. You'll hear he can walk on water. You'll hear he can convince animals and plants and people to do whatever he wants. No prison cell can hold him. The only way to stop him is to end his life. At the end of this trial, we will ask you to execute the defendant, and I am confident that you will find that is what you must do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This time, the defense, would you like to give an opening statement?
Yes.
My name is Sarah Somerville, and along with lead counsel Jeanne Bishop, I represent the defendant, Jesus of Nazareth. As the state has said, in order for you to put this man to death, the state must prove beyond a reasonable doubt one of two things. Either that this man's crime had infected more than one victim, or that it was a particularly heinous crime. The state's own witnesses will make it virtually impossible for them to establish either of those factors. As to the first factor, did his crime involve more than one victim? Jesus is guilty of a serious crime, the crime of blasphemy. The only victim of the crime of blasphemy is God. And that is the only crime that he is guilty of. There simply are no earthly victims in this case. As to the second aggravating factor, was his crime particularly heinous? All of the witnesses you will hear today will talk to you about what Jesus taught. And he taught them mercy, and he taught forgiveness, and he taught love. No reasonable person could possibly find any of those teachings heinous. Therefore, at the end of these proceedings, we will ask you to commit an act of mercy and spare this man's life.
Thank you very much. Call the first witness.
Judge, the state calls the rich young ruler.
Sir, do you agree that the testimony you will give in the cause now pending before this court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you. You may inquire.
Good evening. Would you introduce yourself to the jury, please?
My name is David.
And David, what do you do for a living?
I am in charge of a olive press.
But is that a business or?
Yeah, we actually press most of the olives for the entire area around our small community.
Okay. So you have employees.
I do.
Do you also have a family?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about your family.
I have an average-sized family. There's about 9 children, and you know, we work together as a business.
Okay. Pressing olives.
We do, yes.
And have you had an occasion to meet the defendant?
I have.
Could you tell the jury of what that was?
Well, I had heard about him. Some of my employees had talked about this man who does magic and heals the sick and things of that nature. And so I sought him out, and I wanted to talk to him.
Did you get a chance to talk to him?
I did, yeah.
What did that conversation look like?
Well, I approached him and I asked him, you know, simply, you know, good sir, what must I do to inherit eternal life?
Let me stop you there. Why did you ask him what you have to do to inherit eternal life?
Well, people were calling him a good teacher, that he was similar to any of the other religious authorities, and he seemed to have a different way about him, and I, you know, like any of us, wanted to really know what the future, and what eternal future awaited myself and my family.
He was the man you sought out for that?
Yes.
So you asked him this question, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Did he have an answer for you?
Yeah, he listed some of the things that we're all familiar with. We've all learned, you know, listening to the oral traditions given to us, and discussed, you know, the first 10 of the many commandments that Moses gave us. You know, don't you know, worship God, don't commit adultery, tell the truth, those types of things.
Have you followed those?
I have.
Did you tell Jesus as much?
I did, yeah.
So was that the end of your conversation?
Well, I asked him, you know, is there anything else that I like?
And his response?
Yeah, he said, you know, he said, just one thing you lack, go sell everything you have, give to the poor, and you will inherit eternal life.
Sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and follow him. That was his advice.
It was.
Let's talk to the jury a little bit about what that would mean in practical terms. What would it mean for your career?
Well, I'd be finished. I can't imagine providing for my family through the cold winters, you know, without having stored up the money necessary in the fall.
Okay, and so without a career, what happens to your family?
I don't know. I guess we'd beg, like you see the common beggars in the streets, just destitute. And my children, I don't know what would become of them.
Okay, and so your family would be destitute. If you sold everything and gave it all to the poor, what would happen to your employees?
Well, I provide what I hope is a fair and just wage, and again, they would have nothing. Like my family, I mean, they too depend on the salary and the wages that I pay them. I don't know. I can't imagine what they would do.
So you have a sizable business that would then lose all of its employees, and your family would lose their support, even if they've never heard of Jesus?
Yeah, none of them. I mean, in fact, you know, they were busy. They were working hard the day that I was able to get away briefly. And, yeah, I don't know what they would do, but they would be impacted regardless of. They'd be impacted by my decisions based on what this man said.
No further questions. Pass the witness, Judge.
Cross-examination.
David, I'd like to talk to you about the day that you met Jesus. You sought out Jesus as a teacher.
I did.
To reassure you, really.
Yes.
And when he told you what he thought you lacked, when you asked him what you lacked, he told just you that, correct?
In a matter of speaking, yes.
Was he speaking to you?
He was.
And he only was speaking to you in that moment.
You could say that.
And you went away, grieving because you didn't like the answer that Jesus gave you.
Correct.
Nothing.
Just briefly,
Okay.
opposing counsel made it seem as if Jesus was talking only to you. Were you the only person near Jesus that day?
No.
Could everyone else hear what he was saying?
Hundreds.
Why did you go away from Jesus grieving?
I couldn't imagine what would become of my family if I did what Jesus asked.
And you had no assurance of eternal life?
I couldn't be sure. It was a choice between eternal life and my family. It was an impossible decision.
No further questions, Jeff.
Okay, any recross?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony, sir. You may step down. Next witness.
Your Honor, the state calls Simon Peter. Yes, they just weren't here.
Oh, sorry. You agree that the testimony you will give in the cause now pending before the court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much.
Simon Peter, do you know the defendant seated in the middle of the council table to my left?
Yes, I do.
And who is that?
He's Jesus of Nazareth.
Do you believe him to be the Son of God?
Yes, I do.
And is that based on the conversations you've had with the defendant?
Yes.
Do you recall a time when you said to the defendant, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," and his response to you was, "Flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven"?
Yes. What a great day. What a great day.
And the other disciples were there when that conversation was held, correct?
Yes.
And another time, you recall talking to the Pharisee Nicodemus.
Yes, I do.
And at that time, the defendant said, "God so loved the world that he gave his only son." You recall that?
Yes.
And you understood him to be referring to himself. Is that right?
Yes, I did.
And another time, do you remember a woman at the well who was approached by the defendant? And she said, "I know that the Messiah is coming." And the defendant said, "I am he, the one who is speaking to you."
Yes, I remember that.
Let's go back to how you met the defendant. Could you describe that for the jury?
Wow, what a great day. And yet it wasn't just one day. There were times when we met. I remember my brother Andrew coming and sharing with me with great enthusiasm that he had found the Messiah. He found the one who was to come. And I thought about it, and it didn't really stick with me all that much. But there was this day when he was beside the seashore, and thousands were gathering with him, and they were having this great conversation, and more gathered. And he looked to me and he asked me to take him out to the deeper end of the water, and I couldn't believe it. And here I am, out of all of the people that are there, my boat is there, and Jesus asked me, and boy, we went out, and as he spoke, I couldn't believe what I was hearing for the first time. It made sense. I mean, I'm not a real educated guy. I'm a businessman. I just do what I do, but man, I could understand every word, and it burned on the inside of my heart.
And after that, you followed him, and you were by his side as he traveled and spoke. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I was.
Your Honor, before I continue, I realize I neglected something we covered in the pre-trial, but I just want to put it on the record that there's two stipulations between the parties here. One of which is that this particular witness, Simon Peter, because he is of his association with the defendant, we are treating as a hostile witness and treating as if on cross-examination.
So stipulated, Your Honor.
Okay, court accepts the stipulation.
And the other is that if necessary, we will be able to use the Bible to either refresh recollection or to impeach.
Which we stipulated that as well.
Okay, court accepts that stipulation also.
Thank you. Now, let's go back to talking about what happened when you followed the defendant. Do you recall him at one point actually walking on water?
Yes, I do.
And did you see that yourself? Did you see him walk across the
With
water?
my very eyes. I couldn't believe it. I thought it was a ghost at first. Oh man, you should have been there. I mean, it was crazy.
And did you try to do it yourself?
I did. I did. I tried to do it. I mean, I really wanted to know that it was him. And so,
How'd that work out?
oh man, I got out there, but yeah, it didn't last very long.
And you sang.
Yes, I did.
Have you seen, besides the defendant, have you ever seen anyone else walk on the water?
No, I can't say I have.
Now, you would agree with me, based on the years that you spent with the defendant, that he's someone of great power, and that walking on water is part of that great power that he has.
Yes.
And his great power includes the ability to draw large crowds, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
And in fact, you've been there when he's drawn crowds of 4,000, 5,000 people.
Yes.
And they will sit on a hillside for hours and listen to him talk.
For hours, just mesmerized by his words.
And in fact, often people are so eager to get near him that they crowd in and will even break into the home where he's being kept. And at one point, through the ceiling of that room.
Yes, but I wouldn't call it breaking in.
Did they cut a hole in the ceiling
Well, yeah.
and lower someone down on a mat?
Yeah, that did take place, yes.
All right. Now, those of you that were following the defendant closely, how many roughly in number were there?
Well, our inner core was about 3 of us, but then there were 12 altogether, and a lot of different personalities.
Okay, I would imagine. Now, those 12 of you that were following him closely, you didn't live richly, did you?
Oh, no, no.
And in fact, you pooled your resources and shared?
Certainly. Some of them were even family members, so that made it even better. We could come together and pool our resources, yes, sir.
For example, your brother was among the group, is that
Yes, yes.
At one point, you recall the defendant sending out 70 men to towns and villages.
Yes.
And when he sent them out, he said that, take with you no bag and no sandals, no change of clothes. Is that correct?
Yes, boy, that was great. Those were great times. You had to trust. You had to have faith.
And because basically you were taking a vow of poverty, correct?
Yeah.
Now earlier, we heard from a rich young man who talked about his encounter with Jesus, with the defendant. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
And at that time, after that person left, do you recall the defendant saying, "Truly I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven"?
Yes.
And he also said that it would be as difficult as a camel passing through the eye of a needle.
Yes.
And another time, do you recall going with the defendant to the land of the Gadarenes?
Yes, I do.
And there was something unusual there, which was there was someone who was possessed with a demon. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the demon was, in fact, cast out by the defendant. He's that powerful, correct?
Yes, he was.
And once it was cast out, the demon asked the defendant to be cast into a herd of pigs that belonged to the people of that village, correct?
Yes.
And at that point, the pigs threw themselves over a cliff and perished.
Yes, they did.
And the whole town begged him to leave.
Yeah, after that, it just, it didn't go well. It didn't go too well after that.
Now, you remember many of the things that the defendant said. Do you recall him giving a sermon on a mountaintop?
Yes.
And one of the things he said at that time is that if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other one also.
Yes.
And if someone wants to take your coat, give them your cloak as well.
Yes, he did.
There was another time that you were with the defendant when his mother and his brothers arrived to visit. You remember that?
Yes.
And you were inside a room with the defendant. The mother and the brothers were outside. And what the defendant said was, "Who are my mother and brothers?" And looking at you and the others, he said, "Here are my mother and brothers." Is that what he said?
Yes, he did.
And he didn't let his mother and his brothers into the house, did he?
No.
Do you recall another time he said, "Everyone who's left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or fields for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and receive eternal life"? Do you recall that time?
Yes, I do.
And weren't you also there when he said that he didn't come to bring peace, but that he came to set a man against his father and daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against mother-in-law, that one's foes will be members of one's own household. You recall him saying that?
Yes, I do.
Now, you mentioned earlier that he chose you, a fisherman, to follow him, to be one of the inner core. In fact, you said the inner core of 3, is that correct?
Yes.
And you had an important role in that group, didn't you?
Yes.
Now, and you also mentioned earlier that you're not a learned man. In fact, you were recruited even though you didn't know how to read or write. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
And that was true of most of the others who were those close followers, correct?
That is true.
Now, the people who were learned, who knew how to read and write, many of them were the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees of the community, etc.
Yes, sir.
And it would also be fair to say that the defendant showed a certain contempt for those people, didn't he? At times.
At times. At times.
In fact, didn't he call them a brood of vipers?
Yes.
And say that they are like whitewashed tombs full of bones and dead men and filth?
Yeah, that was tough.
Now, just yesterday, you were there in person at the arrest of the defendant.
Yes, I was.
And in fact, at that time, you pulled out a sword and you cut off the ear of my slave, Malchus, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
But then, as the ear lay on the ground, the defendant picked up the ear and healed Malchus. Is that right?
Yes, he did.
And that must have been a fascinating thing for you to see.
Yeah, at that time, you're right.
Now, Malchus is still my slave, isn't he? He wasn't freed by Jesus.
No, he sent him back.
And as my slave, I can do with him what I will, correct? As his master.
Yes.
Now, at the supper that you had the night before that arrest, earlier that night, there were 2 among your group who had swords with them, correct?
Yes.
And during that supper, they showed those swords to the defendant, didn't they?
Yes.
And his response upon seeing them was, "It is enough." Is that correct?
That is correct.
Now, another time, this will be my last question for you for now. Do you recall him addressing the money changers in the temple, overturning their gates,
Yes.
and driving them out?
Yes, I remember that very vividly, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cross-examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. You met Jesus because a large crowd had gathered,
Yes.
and he needed you to take him away from the shore so that he could preach to the crowd from the boat.
Yes.
And you heard all of his teachings as he taught the crowd from the boat.
Yes.
Now, counsel asked you about crowds, that thousands of people would gather. Did Jesus ever tell you, go gather up a big crowd of people to come and hear me talk?
No.
Did he ever tell all your followers, hand out leaflets and flyers, tell the crowds to come?
No.
Why were the crowds coming?
If you were ever in his presence, if you were ever there at any of those events, it's like nothing you've ever experienced in life. The words that he spoke were life.
Now I'm going to ask you about 3 different areas where you heard Jesus' teachings and you saw the things he did. And the first of those is about forgiveness. The paralyzed man that was lowered down on the mat through the roof. Counsel asked you about that a moment ago. You remember that?
Yes.
The first thing that happened when he was lowered down by his friends in front of Jesus is that Jesus said, your sins are forgiven, right? Before he even knew what those sins were.
Yes.
Now, Jesus also told a story about a prodigal son, right?
Yes.
One of 2 brothers. He goes to his father and says, I can't wait for you to die, in essence. Give me all of the inheritance I would get now, right?
Yes.
Takes it off into a foreign country and squanders it all. He's destitute and decides that he'll come back and make this abject confession of wrongdoing to his father and asks to be allowed to work as a hired servant, right?
Yes.
And in that story, the father sees that son coming back, and before he even has a chance to make that apology, runs to him and embraces him.
Yes.
Right? Now there's an older brother in that story who's not so happy about this homecoming, right? And that's because he's been doing good all along, right?
Exactly.
He's been working hard,
Yes.
and he's very bitter about this forgiveness because he'd been doing right and his son had been doing wrong.
Yes.
But even that wrongdoer was embraced and forgiven, right?
Yes, he was.
Now I'm going to ask you about a second thing that you heard Jesus talk about and you saw him do, and that is a redemption, kind of a bringing back of people who were outcast, right? You saw him cleanse lepers, people who were outcast from their villages because of the disease they had, right?
Yes.
You saw him touch a woman, or a woman touch him, who had been bleeding for 12 years. And that made her untouchable. No one could have any physical contact with her because of that, right?
Yes.
And she was cleansed of that disease, right?
Yes.
And now able to be touched by her family and people in her community. You saw him give a new life to a man possessed by demons that council asked you about, right?
Yes.
The father had said, please heal my son of these demons. He had been actually living in a graveyard, right?
Yes.
Living among the dead, among tombs, because he couldn't be in his village.
Yes.
And when Jesus cast out those demons, that boy was restored to his community.
That's right.
Now, one of your cohorts and the people that followed Jesus was a man who used to be a tax collector, right?
Yes.
One of the most hated people in society because he collaborated with the Romans and took money from his fellows and took a cut and enriched himself, in essence, by their oppression.
Yes.
And he gave him a new name and a new career as someone who was preaching the good news to the poor.
Yes.
You saw him cure diseases of people who were near death, bringing them back to life.
Yes, I did.
And you even saw him heal people who could be considered his enemies. You saw him heal one of the people who had come to arrest him, right?
Yes. He healed my mother-in-law.
Right? And I'm going to ask you now a third topic, and that is about the purpose of God. That Jesus told stories about that. He told stories about this tiny mustard seed that could grow into this enormous tree and bear fruit.
Yes.
He told a story about a lost sheep, where there's 99 sheep that are there with the shepherd, following the rules, staying with him, but there's one sheep that goes astray, right?
Yes.
And that the good shepherd, God, would search after that sheep and find it and bring it home.
Yes.
And he talked about this parable of a lost coin, a woman that lost this precious gold coin, who searches her house and finds it. And she rejoices with her neighbors and friends.
Yes.
And he talked about us being like that to God, that we are that precious. That even as precious as the birds of the air are, that he knows every one of them, that we're more precious to him, correct?
That is correct.
Now I want to ask you about that incident that happened when Jesus was arrested. You saw that a mob was coming to arrest him, and so you pulled a sword, right?
Yes.
But Jesus didn't tell you to bring that sword.
No.
He didn't give you that sword.
No.
And he didn't tell you to use that sword.
No, he didn't.
And in fact, when you did, he rebuked you.
Oh my goodness, I couldn't believe it. I mean, here I am. I'm protecting him because that's what I do. I'm that kind of guy. I'm with you all the way. And he just took the ear and put it back on. I couldn't believe that.
And then he said to you that those who live by the sword will die by the sword.
Yes.
And that's the last words he's ever spoken to you.
Last words. I'll never forget those words.
Thank you very much. Anything further?
Quickly, Your
First of all, I want to make sure I have one thing straight, and that is the story, the parable that you heard about the two sons. Now, your understanding was the defendant was telling this as a model of how things should be, correct?
Yes.
And what happened in that story is there was two sons, and one of them was hardworking and showed up every day and built up that family's business, correct?
Yes.
And then the other one took all the money that he could from his inheritance, went and squandered it, and didn't do the work, correct?
Correct.
And in the story, the one who celebrated is the one who squandered the money. Is that right?
That's correct.
Now, about the sword, now we already talked about how at the supper that you had just a few days ago now, that swords were shown by the disciples, correct?
Yes.
And so the defendant knew that there were swords amongst you, and he didn't take them away, correct?
That's true, that's correct.
And he certainly has that power, doesn't he?
Yes.
Now, you talked at the start of the cross-examination about the great power that he had to attract crowds. That he didn't need to send you out to round up a crowd. People came, correct?
Yes.
And you believe that's because he's the Messiah, correct?
Yes, I do.
And you think that because he told you that.
Yes.
And you weren't the only person who thought that.
No, many more thought.
All right. Oh. Didn't Jesus also say, make no oath other than yes, yes, or no, no? Anything more comes from the evil one?
I think we might need to get some help on that.
Okay. I am going to... Your Honor, may I refresh recollection?
Yes?
I ask you to read Matthew 5:33 silently to yourself. Having reviewed that, is that what he said?
Yes.
And when you sat down, the first thing you did was take an oath. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Thank you. Nothing?
Thank you. Any recross? May this witness be excused? Thank you very much. Be careful when you step down. Any other witnesses?
No, Your Honor. This time, go to press.
Okay, thank you very much. Defense, any witnesses?
Thank you, Your Honor. This time we'd like to call the centurion.
Okay, sir, do you agree that the testimony you will give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, Your Honor, I do.
Your witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. Will you please state your name and your occupation for the jury?
My name is Lucas, and I am a Roman centurion.
And what is a centurion?
A centurion is someone who is given the power and authority over between 80 and 100 Roman soldiers.
And when you say you have power and authority over these soldiers, what is it that you do?
We are currently stationed in the town of Capernaum, and our job is simply to keep the peace. And so my men will go out on patrols and make sure nothing's going on. And so I have the ultimate authority over them.
Okay. And in this position, do you wear a uniform?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Would you mind describing it?
It's not currently the uniform I'm in. The uniform I wear when I'm on duty is very ornate. For lack of a better term, it is shiny. And so it's very obvious when I'm out and about. It also has quite a large headdress for the helmet. And so it stands out. It's very obvious who I am and what I do.
And when you are in the community, do you always wear a uniform?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
All right. I'd like to talk to you about when you came to know Jesus. Where do you live?
I live in the town of Capernaum.
Okay. And who lives with you?
I have my wife, my children, and my servants.
All right. How did you hear about Jesus?
I'm on fairly good terms with the Jews in the area, and I had, when I'm out and about, you hear things, you hear rumblings, and so the man Jesus, this name had come up before when I was out in town, and then I heard that he was in town.
And when you heard he was in town, were you threatened by Jesus coming to Capernaum?
No, ma'am, I didn't feel threatened at all.
Okay, and how did you come to meet him?
My servant was very ill, and I had heard that he was in the business of healing, so I immediately left my house to go see if I could get my servant healed.
And when you met Jesus, what did you ask him?
I went and I explained to him that the servant who I really care for is sick, and I was asking him to come to heal my servant.
And what did he say?
He said he would come to my house and to heal the servant, and I immediately refused. I didn't feel like it was necessary for him to come to my home. Since I am an authority figure and I know what it's like to just tell my people what to do when they do it, and I'm answerable to those above me and to Caesar, I knew this man was the same type of person, and he had some kind of authority over sickness, and so it wasn't necessary for him to come to my home. All he had to do was just simply speak the word, and I knew it would happen.
When you said that to Jesus, what did Jesus say to you?
he was quite amazed and was really impressed with my faith.
And then what happened?
He said, go and your servant will be healed.
And when you went home, what did you find?
As soon as I arrived home, my servant was well, and I inquired about the time in which my servant was made well, and we figured it was about the time that Jesus had said, your servant is well, will be made well. It was at the same time.
Nothing further?
Thank you. Cross-examination.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the totality of the conversation that you have with Jesus. In addition to talking about your servant, he also called you a man of great faith.
Yes, ma'am.
And right afterwards, he went on to explain what happens to people at their death. Some will go to what he calls the kingdom of heaven.
I don't recall if I was there for that conversation.
Your Honor, you have witness statements from this witness. May I approach? I'm going to read along out loud,
Yes,
and I want you to follow along silently. When Jesus heard him, he was amazed, and he said to those who followed him, truly I tell you, in no one in Israel have I found such faith. I tell you, many will come from the east and west, and will eat with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven, while the heirs of the kingdom will be thrown into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. I read that correctly, didn't I?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. There are some who will make it to the kingdom of heaven,
Yes, ma'am.
and they'll have eternal life.
Yes.
Okay, and then not everyone gets to go to the kingdom of heaven now, right?
That appears to be the implication.
He described where they will go as outer darkness. Did
Yes,
he
ma'am.
describe it that way? And he said it's a place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth.
Yes.
When you went to Jesus to get your slave healed, you would have done anything he said, right?
Yes, ma'am, probably.
And to clarify the point, we keep calling him your servant, but this man is your slave, right?
Yes.
You own him,
Yes, ma'am.
and you would have done anything Jesus said. Within reason.
Within reason, absolutely.
Jesus healed your slave.
Yes, ma'am.
He didn't set your slave free, did he?
No, ma'am, he did not.
And he didn't tell you to.
No, ma'am, he did not.
He's still your slave today.
Yes, ma'am.
Made much better.
Yes.
He can serve you much better well than he could sick.
Yes, ma'am.
No further questions.
Okay, and you recross.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony, sir. You may step down. Okay, next witness, please.
Just we call the woman talking about her.
I'm sorry, please. Counsel, who are you calling?
Judge, we're calling Dorcas.
Okay, do you agree that the testimony you will give in the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please state your name loudly and clearly.
My name is Dorcas.
Ma'am, where do you live?
I live in Jerusalem.
Did you happen to meet my client, Jesus of Nazareth, in Jerusalem?
Yes, I did.
The day that you met him, what had you been doing earlier that day?
I had been caught in the act of adultery.
You were with a man who was not your husband?
Yes, that is true.
And who was it that caught you in that act?
My neighbors, and they brought me to the scribes and the Pharisees, and they brought me in front of Jesus and the crowd of all of my neighbors and people that I knew in the community.
When the people that were your neighbors who caught you brought you to the scribes and Pharisees, what did the scribes and Pharisees say?
Well, they told me that by the law of Moses, I deserved to be stoned to death.
And then they took you to the temple?
Yes, they did.
Who was present at the temple?
Jesus was there in the middle, and around him were a crowd of people who had come to hear him speak.
When the scribes and Pharisees brought you to the temple where Jesus was, where did they place you?
They placed me in the middle of everything, right in front of Jesus.
Did they have anything with them?
Stones, lots of stones.
What did you think was going to happen in that moment?
I was sure I was going to die.
Did they ask anything of Jesus?
They made him aware of the law of Moses as if he wouldn't have known, and they asked him what should be done.
Did they tell him what you had done?
They did. They told him that I had been caught in adultery.
And that act that they accused you of, were you innocent or guilty of that?
I was guilty.
How did Jesus respond to their question?
It was the most peculiar thing. He had been speaking, and so I anticipated him to answer them forthrightly, but he kneeled down and began to draw something in the dirt.
Could you see what it was?
I couldn't, no.
And so when he didn't answer their question right away, what did they do?
They began to pester him and pelt him with many more questions. It seemed as though if they couldn't get him to answer that one, they would get him to answer anything.
What did he do next?
He told them that anyone who was without sin should throw the first stone.
After he said that, what did Jesus do?
He knelt back down and began drawing in the dirt again.
And when he said that, what did the crowd then do?
In all honesty, I didn't see. My eyes were closed. I was preparing to be stoned. But nothing happened, and I opened one eye slightly and saw feet around me starting to walk away. And one by one they left until I was left alone with Jesus.
Did he say anything to you?
Well, he finally got up from where he was sitting and from drawing in the dirt, and he looked at me and he asked me where my accusers were and if there was anyone left who had condemned me.
What did you say?
I told him that no one was left.
And then what did he say to you?
He told me that since no one had condemned me, that neither did he, and that I should go and live my life and sin no more.
And did you?
I did.
Okay, cross-examination.
Thank you. Certainly sounds like a memorable experience. You said that he wrote in the dirt. Do you recall what he was writing?
I don't. It was kind of a traumatic experience for me.
Now you said that he instructed, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. Is that right?
That's correct.
So presumably if there was someone there who believed in the Mosaic law and was without sin, they would have thrown a stone.
Yes.
But no one did, including the defendant.
Correct.
Thank you.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor, we have no further witnesses. The defense rests.
Okay, thank you very much. You may step down. Okay, at this time, counsel is ready for closing argument.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
How are we going to do it? Is it going to be a A argument, a B argument, or is it just one argument each?
I'm sorry. Okay, move over here. Avoid that problem. Your Honor, I would ask to reserve a brief rebuttal.
You may begin when ready.
Thank you. We've heard a lot of fascinating testimony this evening. And as my co-counsel Joy Tall said at the start of the trial, we don't relish the role that we have before you tonight. And that's because it's all tragedy. Criminal law is all tragedy. That as prosecutors, we can't unmurder somebody. We can't unrape a woman. The best that we can do as prosecutors is avert tragedies in the future. And that is why we are bringing this action before you tonight, is to avert a tragedy in the future. Multiple tragedies, really. And that's what I'll describe for you now. As we discussed in the opening, you're going to get a verdict form shortly from the judge with which to make a decision. And there's going to be two questions on that verdict form. The first is, has the government proven at least one of two aggravating factors? We don't have to prove both, just one of the two. And those two aggravating factors are, first, did the blasphemy affect more than one person? And second, was the crime particularly heinous? Now first, as to the blasphemy affecting more than one person. We heard from Peter about the number of people who heard the defendant claim that he was the Messiah. That is the blasphemy. Now, does that create a harm? Of course it does. We also heard from Peter about the power of the defendant as the Messiah, the crowds coming towards him, following him. And that they knew that belief that was put out there, that he was the Messiah. That when he told the woman at the well, it is me who stands before you. Now, what kind of power does that give you? When people think that you're the Messiah, when people think that you're the Son of God, it gives you the power of language. It gives you influence over people so that they will do what you want. And that's exactly what happened has happened. And that is where the danger lies. And that takes us to the second aggravating factor of the heinousness of the harm that was done and is threatened. Now we heard about one incident about the pigs of the Gadarenes. So you've got this village. They have a herd of pigs. That's their livelihood. And think how odd this story is for someone who's described as being so merciful. That he goes there, there's a demon in one person. He casts the demon out. And the demon says, put me in those pigs. And he listens to the demon. And puts the demon into the pigs. And at that point, the economic livelihood of that village runs over a cliff. And they force him out of town. They're upset. Of course they're upset. Of course they're upset. Their pigs are all dead. That is an economic catastrophe for that small group. Now, how much might this multiply? Let me talk first about his threat to the economy generally. Now, the economy of that village is destroyed through his actions because he listened to a demon. A power that he was given to be called there, to be popular because of the blasphemy. Well, what else does he teach? Well, we heard from the rich young ruler, and his advice to that person was, just give away everything that you have. Just give it away to the poor. Now, what does that do to our economy? What happens when the business owner, like that one, just gives away everything he has and there's no business to go forward? What happens to our economy when that happens? We're all lost if that happens. Not just his servants, his family. But we don't go forward in the way that we should. And we heard from others as well that the prodigal son, that story of the two sons. One of them is hardworking and industrious. The other one goes and wastes all the money. And who is celebrated? The one who doesn't waste all the money. We don't have a future if that's who is celebrated. And what about families, the bedrock of our society? He rejected his own mother and brothers and said, these 12 guys who are with me, that's my mother and brothers. But it wasn't just for himself that he got that. He said, I don't come to bring peace, but to set a mother against her daughter, a son against his father. What does that do? What does that do to our society if that takes hold, that ethic, given the power that this man has? Without an economy, without the bedrock of our families. But what else? What about our very security? What happens with our enemies when they find that what we're going to do is turn the other cheek? That if they take our cloak, we'll give them our coat as well. What will happen to us as a whole if that's our heaven? What society can survive and go on with that? And you know what's interesting about that as well is this, that he's telling us that. He told everybody on that mountainside that, disarm yourselves, turn your cheek, let them attack you. But yet, when his followers had swords, he said, it is enough. And sure enough, it gets used to do violence. And what an odd story that was as well. My own slave, Malchus. The defendant knows that his followers have swords. Pretty predictably, at his arrest, one of those swords is used to lop off the ear. And then, in front of everybody, he performs the miracle of healing the ear. We don't deny that he has that power. And of course, everyone is amazed at that power. But did he free the slave? Did he free the centurion slave? I'll be honest with you. I'm better off. My slave is healed. He can hear out of both ears. Then what of those followers? Given the power that he has with his blasphemy and his ability to do things like walk on water, who does he pick to be closest to him? He picks the illiterate. And that's the last danger that I'll talk about. The last aspect that makes that threat heinous is he has closest to him those who can't read or write, those who can't carry on our heritage, those who can't move forward what we are. And the people who do know how to read and write, who do know our heritage, the scribes, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, what does he do to them? He pushes them away. He calls them a brood of vipers. He says that they are nothing more than a whitewashed. And then we'll get to the second question that you will answer, which is, does the mitigation, that is the mercy that they speak of, outweigh the aggravating factors? Or does the aggravating factors outweigh the mitigation? Sorry. Let's talk about both sides of that equation. First, the mitigation that they present, that this person was merciful and good. Well, not so merciful and good to my slave. Yes, he was healed, but now I can do with him what I want. Or the centurion slave, for that matter. Where was the mercy for the Gadarenes? On the other side, the aggravating factors that I've already put before you. That not only those things in the past, like the pigs, but those things in the future, to tear apart our families, to tear apart our economy, to leave us undefended, and to leave us unlettered, not knowing our own heritage. That is a deep and abiding tragedy that we face. And that's why we come before you, asking you to avert the tragedy for the many, even though it means the tragedy for the one that offended.
Thank you very much. Vince.
Can everyone hear me? My client, Jesus of Nazareth, this living, breathing person, sits before you now with his life in your hands. You can make the decision that will send him to a gurney where he will be strapped down and a needle inserted in his veins, and his life will be ended, his breath will stop. That's the power that the law gives you. And you have to exercise that power. You have to make that decision based on the law that the judge is going to give you at the close of these arguments. And you'll be instructed about these factors that the government bears the burden of proving. First, these aggravating factors, that there was more than one victim, or that these acts were particularly heinous. And number two, that the aggravation so outweighs the mitigating evidence that you've heard that this man's life should be taken. And clearly the answer to those questions is the government has failed to meet that burden. Let's start with the more than one victim. The crime of which my client's been convicted is blasphemy, and we do not deny the blasphemy or the conviction. He is guilty. But the only victim of that is God alone. None of the people who heard what Jesus said and did can be described as victims. You heard them as the beneficiaries of goodness, of the preaching of providence and love and mercy and care. As to his acts being especially heinous, no one could describe these acts that he did of healing, of preaching peace, of restoring people to community. No one could describe those things as heinous, as something that's so appalling that we have to take a human life. As to the mitigation, you heard the good that this man has done. Bringing sick people back to life. Having lepers able to rejoin the community. A man possessed with demons suddenly able to live among his fellows. A human being more important than a herd And you heard about the stories that he told and the things that he taught. And all of those things go to what we know about God, about God's forgiveness, his redemption, and his purpose. You are being asked to say, this man's been found guilty of blasphemy, and therefore we're going to kill him. But I would suggest that faith in God would lead you to exactly the opposite conclusion. That your very faith in God would say, we cannot have a death penalty for this man or any man, innocent or guilty. Why? Based on these three things we know about God. Number one, there is no one beyond the forgiveness of God. No one. Not that paralytic man who had sinned, whose sins were forgiven. Not that prodigal who wished his father dead and took his money and spent it. What we know about God is that he's going to forgive. He's going to restore. He's going to give a second chance to that person, just like every single one of you and me and everyone in this room needs that second chance and that mercy. God shows that. The second thing we know about God is that no one's beyond the redemption of God. You've heard these stories of people restored, people who are outcast, the tax collector, the bleeding woman, people who were excluded from society are restored by newness of life. We can take his crime and freeze it in time and say, you did this one thing, and now we are going to cut short your life. We're going to kill you. But that's not God's way. That's not the way of faith. The third thing we know about God is that there's no one beyond the purpose of God. That's the point behind these stories you heard about this one sheep, about this one coin, about this teeny mustard seed. We don't look at any human being, including my client, and say, there is no more purpose for you. You are not a child of God. You are human garbage, and we are going to throw you away. We're going to wipe you off the face of this planet. That's what the death penalty does. And so I'm asking, if we know all these things about our God, then how can we have a death penalty? How can we impose death on another human being when we ourselves are flawed? What we know from this woman you heard from who testified that she was guilty, caught in the act of a crime that carries the punishment of death. Jesus didn't say, oh, spare her, she might be innocent. She wasn't. And he didn't say, oh, the law of Moses is stupid, we shouldn't kill people who just sleep with other people. He didn't say that either. He did not question whether she deserved to die. He questioned whether we deserved to kill her. The law put stones in the hands of those people, but they dropped them all. Why? Because they knew that they were flawed, that they were sinners, and that they could not carry out this sentence that would, in essence, have them playing God, cutting short the life that only God can create. Only God can create and sustain. And so I'm asking you to put aside this power the law gives you to kill, to drop the stones in the dirt and walk away and to spare the life of my client.
Thank you very much. People, well,
On this point of mitigation, the defense asks for mercy and has put before you a few instances of mercy that the defendant has shown. But consider this, every time that he did that, it was so public. It added to his own power. That when he spoke to the woman caught in adultery, when he confronted the Pharisees, that was part of his ongoing feud with them. When he healed the ear, it's a public show. Where is this mercy? Where was it for those two slaves? Well, I certainly would rather be free than to remain enslaved. Where was the mercy for the people whose livelihood was destroyed in Gadarene? Where's the mercy for the people in California who don't have enough to eat? Or for the lonely who are in their own rooms? For those who cry out for justice? What's threatened? I described that to some degree, but I want to add one thing. He said, from the first witness we had here today, he said, give away everything you have and give it to the poor. You know, there's people who give away their money and don't give it to the poor.
And you know what it builds? It builds this. This. Someone gave the money to build this. This floor I'm standing on. This place that we're inside of. And that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Because our heritage precedes. We can reach back into the past and know our history and move forward. Because we celebrate the literate, the learned, the opposite of what he drew near. And we don't disown those who are wealthy if they choose to be generous in building something like this that adds to all of our legacies. This is a good place. So again, we do ask for a tragedy to one person, to avert the tragedy for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the trial. It is now time for you to make your decision. I'm going to briefly outline the process of deliberation, and I will give you rules to follow. You will be given a verdict form that contains 2 questions. Only answer the second question if your answer to the first question is yes. The first question is, has the government proven beyond a reasonable doubt the existence of at least one aggravating factor? You must be unanimous as to what aggravating factor you find to exist. The government has presented 2 aggravating factors. A, was there more than one victim of the crime? B, was the crime especially heinous? Only one aggravating factor must be proven to answer yes to the first question. If the answer is no, the defendant will be sentenced to life in prison without parole. If you vote yes on this first question, you will proceed to the second question. Has the government proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the aggravating circumstances or circumstances outweigh any mitigating facts? If your answer is no, then the sentence is life without parole. If your answer is yes, then the sentence is death. As you deliberate, keep in mind that the defendant has already been convicted of the crime of blasphemy. There is no need to revisit this conviction. Focus instead on the aggravating and mitigating factors that will determine the sentence. When you retire to the jury room, you should choose a 4-person to lead you and then begin your discussion. Reflect on the testimony and arguments you have heard and listen to one another. It takes 12 votes, a unanimous vote, to answer yes or no to either or both questions. Thank you very much.
All right. So now what we're going to ask you to do is form yourself into groups of 12, and we'll pass out the verdict form, and we'll give you 20-25 minutes to deliberate, because in the end, we leave it to you. So we won't assign groups. Just find, it doesn't have to be exactly 12, more or less.
This general here.
Here.